The rain fell in sheets across the cemetery on that bleak April morning in 1877, turning the freshly dug earth into mud that clung to Faith Sullivan's boots as she stood before her husband's grave. Her 6-month-old daughter, Emma, whimpered against her chest, sheltered beneath her shawl from the relentless downpour. Faith hadn't noticed when the other mourners had departed few, as they were leaving her alone with her grief and her child in the unforgiving Montana Territory weather. She didn't notice when the rain stopped hitting her black mourning dress, but she did notice the presence of someone beside her, tall and steady as an oak. "Madam," came a deep voice, gentle despite its roughness, "you and your little one shouldn't be standing out in this weather." Faith looked up to see a face she vaguely recognized beneath the brim of a worn cowboy hat. He held a large black umbrella over her and Emma, his own shoulders getting soaked in the process. "Thank you," she managed, her voice barely audible above the rain, "but I'm not ready to leave him yet." The man, Colton Reed, she now remembered, nodded solemnly. "Then I'll wait with you if you don't mind." Faith couldn't find the words to respond, so she simply nodded and returned her gaze to the simple wooden marker. Thomas Sullivan, 1849–1877, beloved husband and father. The influenza had taken him so quickly that Faith still expected to see him walking through their cabin door each evening, covered in dirt from the mine, his smile bright despite his exhaustion. They stood in silence for what felt like hours, though it couldn't have been more than 20 minutes. Emma began to fuss more insistently, hungry and uncomfortable despite the shelter of the umbrella. "You should get your baby home, Mrs. Sullivan," Colton said softly, no hint of impatience in his tone. Faith nodded, knowing he was right. "Yes, I suppose I should." She hesitated, then asked, "Did you know Thomas well, Mr. Reed?" "Not as well as I would have liked," he admitted. "We worked the same shift at the Silver Creek mine for a spell. He spoke of you and your daughter often. Proudest man I ever met." A fresh wave of grief washed over Faith, and she clutched Emma tighter. "I don't know what I'm going to do," she whispered, the words escaping before she could stop them. Colton shifted slightly, keeping the umbrella firmly over them. "If you'll allow me, I'd be happy to see you safely home." Faith looked up at him again. Colton Reed was not what most would call handsome, with his weathered face and the thin scar that ran along his jaw, but there was something in his steady blue eyes that spoke of honesty and decency, rare commodities in a mining town like Silver Gulch. "Thank you," she said. "That would be kind." As they walked away from the grave, Faith cast one last glance over her shoulder. It seemed impossible that her life with Thomas had been reduced to that small mound of mud and a wooden marker. She stumbled slightly on the uneven ground, and Colton's free hand caught her elbow, strong and sure. "Careful now," he murmured. "Ground's treacherous after the rain." They made their way through the cemetery and onto the muddy main street of Silver Gulch. The mining town was a collection of hastily constructed buildings, with the saloon being the most solid structure. Men eyed them as they passed, their gazes lingering on Faith in a way that made her uncomfortable. "Ignore them," Colton said quietly. "Most are just sorry they didn't have the decency to stay for the whole service." Faith's small cabin sat on the outskirts of town, a modest dwelling that Thomas had built with his own hands when they'd first arrived from Pennsylvania 2 years ago. The sight of it now, knowing he would never again cross its threshold, nearly broke her. "Would you like me to start a fire for you?" Colton asked as they reached the door. "It'll be damp inside." Faith hesitated. Propriety dictated that she shouldn't allow a man she barely knew into her home, especially now that she was a widow. But Emma was fussing more persistently, and the thought of entering the cold, empty cabin alone was almost unbearable. "Yes, please," she said finally, "if it's not too much trouble." "No trouble at all, madam." Colton waited on the small porch while Faith unlocked the door, then followed her inside. The cabin was indeed cold and damp, with a mustiness that spoke of grief's neglect. While Faith settled in the rocking chair to nurse Emma, Colton efficiently set about building a fire in the small stone hearth. His movements were practiced and sure, and soon a warm glow filled the room. "I should be going," he said once the fire was crackling steadily. He placed his hat back on his head and moved toward the door. "Mr. Reed," Faith called, making him pause. "Thank you. For the umbrella and for not walking away." Colton nodded, his expression solemn. "I'll check on you tomorrow if that's all right. Might be able to bring some firewood." Before Faith could respond, he was gone, the door closing softly behind him. She looked down at Emma, now contentedly nursing, and felt the first tears since the funeral begin to fall. "What are we going to do now, little one?" she whispered. "What are we going to do without your papa?" The next morning dawned clear and bright, a stark contrast to the previous day's gloom. Faith had slept poorly, Emma waking frequently as if sensing her mother's distress. The fire had died during the night and the cabin was once again cold. Faith was trying to rekindle it with one hand while holding Emma with the other when a knock came at the door. Startled, she called out, "Who is it?" "Colton Reed, madam. I've brought some firewood, like I promised." Faith smoothed her hair and adjusted Emma on her hip before opening the door. Colton stood there, a substantial pile of split logs in his arms and more stacked neatly beside him. "Good morning, Mrs. Sullivan," he said, his hat already removed and held respectfully at his side. "Hope I'm not calling too early." "Not at all, Mr. Reed. Please come in." Colton carried the wood inside and stacked it neatly beside the hearth. Without being asked, he took over the task of building the fire, his large hands moving with surprising dexterity among the kindling. "How are you faring this morning?" he asked, his eyes on his work. Faith sighed. "As well as can be expected, I suppose. Emma didn't sleep much, which means I didn't either." Colton nodded. Little one sensed these things. He glanced up at the baby, who was watching him with curious eyes. "She has your eyes." Faith felt a small smile tug at her lips despite herself. "Yes, though her father always said she had his chin." She touched Emma's little face gently. "Stubborn like him." The fire caught and Colton stood, brushing his hands on his worn denim pants. "Mrs. Sullivan, I hope you don't think me forward, but I've been giving some thought to your situation." Faith tensed slightly. She'd been in Silver Gulch long enough to know that a widow with a child was vulnerable, especially one without family nearby. "Oh, the mine gives a widow's pension, but it ain't much," Colton said, his expression earnest. "And I know Thomas hadn't been working there long enough to build up much of a claim." Faith swallowed hard. "No, he hadn't. We have some savings, but—" She trailed off, not wanting to admit just how precarious her position was. "I thought as much," Colton said with a nod. "I've spoken to Mrs. Abernathy at the general store. She's looking for help, especially with the spring shipments coming in. Said she'd be willing to let you bring the little one with you." Faith stared at him, surprised. You found me work." "Just passed along the opportunity," Colton corrected. "Mrs. Abernathy's been wanting help for a while, but most women in town are either married to miners or work at the saloon." He cleared his throat awkwardly. "She'd be glad to have someone respectable like yourself." "I don't know what to say," Faith murmured, genuinely touched by his thoughtfulness. "Say you'll at least talk to her," Colton suggested. "Store opens at 9. I could watch your little one while you speak with Mrs. Abernathy if you'd like." Faith studied him for a moment. There was nothing in his demeanor that suggested ulterior motives, and she desperately needed the work. "That's very kind of you, Mr. Reed. I'll certainly speak with her." Colton nodded, seeming pleased. "Good, that's good." He hesitated, then added, "I've also brought some stew." My neighbor, Mrs. Chen, made it. She's a fine cook, despite what some folks in town might say about her and her husband. Faith knew of the Chinese couple who lived on the edge of town. Like most immigrants, they faced prejudice from many of Silver Gulch's residents. That's very thoughtful. Please thank her for me. Colton retrieved a covered pot from outside and placed it on her small stove. Should still be warm. Figured you might not have had time for cooking. The simple act of kindness both from Colton and Mrs. Chen brought a lump to Faith's throat. Thank you, she said again, feeling the words were inadequate. Well, Colton said, replacing his hat, I should get to the mine. My shift starts at noon, but I've got some errands beforehand. He moved toward the door, then paused. I'll be back around 8:30 if that suits you. To accompany you to the general store, Faith nodded. Yes, that would be fine. After Colton left, Faith sat at her small table and ate some of Mrs. Chen's stew, which was delicious despite containing ingredients she couldn't identify. Emma sat in her lap, occasionally accepting small spoonfuls that Faith cooled for her. That Mr. Reed is a kind man, Faith told her daughter, who babbled in response. I suppose we're fortunate he was at the funeral yesterday. The thought gave her pause. She hadn't noticed Colton among the mourners, though in her grief she'd hardly noticed anyone. Yet he'd been there, and he'd stayed when everyone else had gone. Why? The question lingered in her mind as she prepared for her meeting with Mrs. Abernathy. She washed herself and Emma, and put on her second-best dress, the best being her black mourning dress, which still hung damp from yesterday's rain. The dress was a simple blue calico, one of the few things she'd brought with her from Pennsylvania, and it was a bit loose now after the stress of the last few weeks. At precisely 8:30, Colton returned. He'd clearly taken time to clean up, his hair still damp from washing and his clothes, while worn, neatly pressed. He carried a small wooden horse, crudely carved but charming. Thought the little one might like something to play with, he said, almost shyly offering the toy to Emma, who immediately grabbed it with chubby hands. You made this? Faith asked, surprised. Colton shrugged. Whittling passes the time, not much else to do in the evenings. As they walked to the general store, Faith carrying Emma and Colton walking beside them, Faith found herself curious about this quiet man who had inserted himself into their lives so suddenly. May I ask you something, Mr. Reed? Course, madam. Why were you at the funeral yesterday? I don't recall Thomas mentioning you as a close friend. Colton was silent for a moment, his stride never faltering. Your husband was a good man, he finally said. Better than most in this town. When word came that he'd passed, well, seemed right to pay my respects. He glanced at her, then away. And I figured there might not be many others who would. The brutal honesty of his assessment stung, but Faith couldn't deny its truth. Thomas had been well liked, but they hadn't been in Silver Gulch long enough to form deep friendships. Most of the miners' wives kept to themselves, wary of newcomers in a place where few people put down permanent roots. That's very considerate of you, Faith said softly. Wasn't trying to be considerate, Colton replied. Just seemed like the decent thing to do. They reached the general store just as Mrs. Abernathy was unlocking the front door. She was a plump woman in her 50s with a no-nonsense manner that belied her kind heart. Mrs. Sullivan, she greeted, her eyes softening at the sight of Emma. Mr. Reed told me about your situation. Come in, come in. Colton tipped his hat. I'll wait out here if that's all right. Give you ladies some privacy to discuss matters. Mrs. Abernathy ushered Faith inside the store, which smelled of coffee, leather, and the various dry goods that lined the shelves. That Colton Reed, she said once the door was closed, is a better man than most give him credit for. You know him well? Faith asked, adjusting Emma in her arms. Known him since he first came to Silver Gulch 3 years ago. Keeps to himself mostly, but he's honest and hardworking." She gave Faith an appraising look. "And he seems to have taken an interest in your welfare." Faith felt a blush rise to her cheeks. "He's simply being kind to a widow and her child." Mrs. Abernathy hummed noncommittally. "Well, let's discuss this position. I need help with inventory, stocking shelves, and minding the counter when I'm busy with other tasks. Hours would be from 9 to 4, 6 days a week. Sundays off, of course." "And Emma?" Faith asked, glancing down at her daughter. "You can keep her in the back room when she's sleeping, and with you at the counter when she's awake, as long as she doesn't fuss too much," Mrs. Abernathy said. "I raised 4 of my own, Mrs. Sullivan. I understand the challenges of motherhood." They discussed wages, which were modest but fair, and Faith accepted the position with gratitude. She would start the following Monday, giving her a few more days to adjust to her new circumstances. When they emerged from the store, Colton was sitting on a bench outside, still whittling. He stood when he saw them. "All settled?" he asked. "Yes," Faith replied with a genuine smile. "I start on Monday. Thank you for arranging this, Mr. Reed." Colton dipped his head modestly. "Mrs. Abernathy's the one giving you the job. I just mentioned the possibility." Mrs. Abernathy snorted softly. "And brought me a fresh caught trout as a reminder of how good my business has been lately." Faith looked at Colton in surprise, but he avoided her gaze, his ears reddening slightly. "Just happened to have an extra fish," he mumbled. "In any case," Faith said, "I'm very grateful to you both." As they walked back toward Faith's cabin, she found herself wondering about this man who seemed so determined to help her. "Mr. Reed," she began, "I hope you don't think me ungrateful, but I must ask, why are you doing all this?" Colton was quiet for so long that Faith thought he might not answer. Finally, he said, "I know what it's like to be alone in a place like this." He glanced at her, then quickly away. "When I first came to Silver Gulch, I was running from some bad decisions. Nobody gave me the time of day except Mrs. Abernathy and the Chens. If they hadn't shown me a bit of kindness, I might not have made it." "And now you're passing that kindness on," Faith observed. Colton shrugged uncomfortably. "Just doing what anyone should do," but they both knew that wasn't true. In a place like Silver Gulch, where life was hard and people were focused on their own survival, this kind of generosity was rare. When they reached Faith's cabin, Colton hesitated at the door. "I've got to get to my shift at the mine," he said, "but I was wondering if I might call on you tomorrow. Bring some more wood, maybe fix that loose step on your porch." Faith should have refused. She was a new widow, and accepting the attentions of another man so soon would raise eyebrows. But the thought of facing another day alone was unbearable, and Colton had been nothing but respectful. "That would be fine, Mr. Reed," she said. "Perhaps you could join us for lunch. It's the least I can do to thank you." A smile transformed Colton's weather-beaten face, making him almost handsome. "I'd like that very much, Mrs. Sullivan." As he walked away, Faith watched him go, Emma babbling in her arms. For the first time since Thomas had fallen ill, she felt a small spark of hope that perhaps they would survive this after all. The next few days fell into a pattern. Colton would arrive in the morning, bringing firewood or game he had hunted, and spend an hour or two making repairs around Faith's cabin. The loose step was fixed, the leaky roof patched, and the squeaky door rehung. They would share a simple meal, during which Colton would entertain Emma with his whittling or funny faces that made the baby girl giggle. Faith learned that Colton had come west after the war, where he had fought for the Union despite being from Virginia. He didn't speak much about his family or what had happened after the war, but Faith sensed there was pain there he wasn't ready to share. He had worked as a ranch hand in Colorado before coming to Montana Territory to try his luck in the silver mines. "Not that I've had much luck," he admitted with a wry smile, "but the work is steady, and that's something." In turn, Faith told him about growing up in Philadelphia, the daughter of a schoolteacher who had died when she was 16. She had worked as a seamstress until meeting Thomas, who had dreams of making his fortune in the West. "He was so certain we would strike it rich," Faith said softly, remembering her husband's enthusiasm. "He wanted to build a big house and give Emma all the things he never had growing up." Colton nodded. "That's a good dream, honorable, but perhaps not realistic," Faith added with a sigh. "I sometimes wonder if we should have stayed in Pennsylvania." "Can't live on what-ifs," Colton said gently. "You made the best decision you could at the time. That's all any of us can do." On Monday morning, Colton arrived earlier than usual to accompany Faith and Emma to the general store for her first day of work. Faith had prepared as best she could, packing a small bag with Emma's necessities and wearing her blue calico dress again, now freshly washed and pressed. "Nervous?" Colton asked as they walked through town. "A little," Faith admitted. "It's been a while since I worked for someone else." "Mrs. Abernathy is fair," Colton assured her. "Strict about some things, but reasonable." The morning passed in a blur of introductions to regular customers and learning the store's organization system. Mrs. Abernathy was indeed fair but exacting, expecting Faith to remember prices and locations of items quickly. Emma, thankfully, was on her best behavior, content to play with the wooden horse Colton had made her and charm the customers who cooed over her. At noon, the bell above the door jingled and Faith looked up to see Colton entering, his hat in his hands. "Madam," he greeted Mrs. Abernathy, then turned to Faith with a smile. "Mrs. Sullivan, thought you might appreciate some lunch on your first day." He placed a cloth-wrapped package on the counter. Inside were thick slices of fresh bread, cheese, and what looked like leftover venison from the stew he had brought the day before. "That's thoughtful of you, Mr. Reed," Mrs. Abernathy said, a knowing glint in her eye. "Faith, why don't you take your lunch break now? You can use the back room." Faith felt herself blushing under Mrs. Abernathy's gaze but nodded. "Thank you." In the small back room, which served as storage and Mrs. Abernathy's office, Faith settled on a chair with Emma in her lap. Colton leaned against the wall, looking slightly out of place among the boxes and ledgers. "How's your first day going?" he asked. "Well, I think," Faith replied, breaking off a small piece of bread for Emma. "Mrs. Abernathy has been very patient." Colton nodded. "Good, that's good." He hesitated, then said, "Faith, Mrs. Sullivan, there's something I wanted to ask you." The sudden seriousness in his tone made Faith look up sharply. "Yes. There's a social at the church this Saturday evening," Colton said, his eyes fixed somewhere over her shoulder. "Mrs. Abernathy mentioned it. Thought it might be good for you to meet more folks in town, especially the other ladies." He cleared his throat. "I'd be happy to escort you if you'd like, and Emma too, of course." Faith was taken aback. A social so soon after Thomas's death would certainly raise eyebrows. And yet the thought of sitting alone in her cabin for another Saturday night was depressing. "I don't know, Mr. Reed," she said hesitantly. "It's only been 2 weeks since Thomas passed." "Just as friends," Colton clarified quickly. "Neighbors, I understand it wouldn't be proper otherwise." Faith considered this. Perhaps it would be good to meet more people in town, especially if she was going to make a life here for herself and Emma. "All right," she decided. "As friends." Colton's smile was warm. "I'll call for you at 6 then." When Saturday evening arrived, Faith found herself unusually nervous as she prepared for the social. She had washed her hair and pinned it up in a simple but elegant style, and wore her black dress out of respect for Thomas, though she had brightened it with a small cameo brooch that had been her mother's. Emma was freshly bathed and dressed in a clean gown, her wispy hair tied with a small ribbon. She seemed to sense her mother's anticipation, babbling excitedly as Faith moved around the cabin. "It's just a church social," Faith told her daughter and herself. "Nothing to be nervous about." But when Colton arrived promptly at 6, Faith's heart skipped traitorously. He had clearly made an effort with his appearance, wearing a clean shirt and vest, his usually unruly hair combed neatly. He even carried a small bunch of wildflowers. "These are for you," he said, offering them somewhat awkwardly. "Thought they might brighten your table." "They're lovely," Faith said, genuinely touched. "Let me put them in water before we go." As she arranged the flowers in a jar, she caught Colton making faces at Emma, who was giggling delightedly from her basket. The sight brought an unexpected warmth to Faith's chest. Thomas had been a good father, but he had often been too tired from his work to play much with Emma. Seeing her daughter's joy at such simple interaction made Faith realize how much the child needed a male presence in her life. The church social was held in the small white clapboard building that served as Silver Gulch's only house of worship. Inside, tables had been set up with food brought by the townspeople, and someone was playing a fiddle in the corner. There were perhaps 30 people present, mostly miners and their families, along with some of the more respectable business owners from town. Faith felt eyes on her as she entered with Colton, who carried Emma's basket. Whispers followed them, and she fought the urge to turn around and flee. "Don't mind them," Colton murmured, close to her ear. "People will always talk." Mrs. Abernathy bustled over, effectively cutting off the whispers with her commanding presence. "Faith, dear, I'm so glad you came," she said warmly. "And you've brought the little one. Come, let me introduce you to some of the ladies." With a reassuring nod from Colton, Faith allowed herself to be led away to a group of women, most of whom were older than her. They welcomed her with varying degrees of warmth, some clearly curious about her relationship with Colton. "Poor dear, losing your husband so young," said one woman, Mrs. Peterson, with what seemed like genuine sympathy. "And with a baby to raise on your own. It's fortunate Mr. Reed has taken an interest in your welfare," added another, Mrs. Daniels, with a slightly pointed tone. Faith straightened her spine. "Mr. Reed has been very kind, as a neighbor should be," she said firmly. "I'm grateful for his assistance during this difficult time." The conversation moved on to other topics, and Faith gradually relaxed. The women were not unkind, merely curious and perhaps a bit wary of a newcomer. By the time they broke for the meal, Faith had been invited to join a sewing circle that met weekly at the church. Colton had kept his distance during her conversations with the women, but now he appeared at her side with a plate of food. "Thought you might be hungry," he said, offering it to her. "And I can hold the little one while you eat if you'd like." Faith handed Emma over, noting how naturally Colton held her, supporting her head and bouncing her gently when she fussed. They found seats at the end of a table, where Faith could eat while Colton entertained Emma. "The ladies seem nice enough," Colton observed. Faith nodded. "They've invited me to join their sewing circle. Mrs. Abernathy says they often take in mending for extra money." "That's good," Colton said. "You're a fine seamstress from what I've seen of your work around the cabin." The fiddle player started a livelier tune, and several couples moved to the cleared space in the center of the room to dance. Faith watched them, a pang of longing in her heart. She and Thomas had loved to dance. Colton followed her gaze. "Would you like to dance, Faith?" he asked softly. "I'm not very good, but I can manage not to step on your toes." Faith hesitated. Dancing so soon after becoming a widow would definitely cause talk, but the music was pulling at her, offering a brief escape from grief. "I shouldn't," she said reluctantly. Probably not, Colton agreed. But sometimes we need to do things that bring us joy, even if others might not understand. Faith looked at him, surprised by the insight. Yes, she said slowly. I suppose that's true. Before she could change her mind, she stood. Mrs. Peterson, she called to the older woman nearby, would you mind watching Emma for a few minutes? Mrs. Peterson looked surprised but pleased. Of course, dear. Bring her here. Colton carefully transferred Emma to Mrs. Peterson's experienced arms, then offered his hand to Faith. Ready. Faith took a deep breath and placed her hand in his. Ready. Colton had not exaggerated his dancing abilities. He was indeed barely adequate, but his earnestness, and the care he took not to step on her feet, made Faith smile. As they moved around the floor, she felt some of the weight of the past weeks lifting from her shoulders. Thank you for bringing me tonight, she said as they circled the room. I didn't realize how much I needed this. Colton's eyes were warm as he looked down at her. Everyone needs community, Faith. No one should stand alone. The words reminded her of the funeral, of how he had appeared beside her with his umbrella. You didn't let me stand alone then, either, she said softly. No, he agreed, and I don't intend to. The simple declaration, spoken without pretense or expectation, touched Faith deeply. For the first time since Thomas's death, she felt truly safe. As spring turned to summer, Faith settled into her new routine. She worked at the general store during the day, attended church and the sewing circle on Sundays, and in the evenings, she often found Colton on her porch, ready to help with whatever needed doing around the cabin. Emma thrived under the attention of both her mother and Colton, who continued to carve toys for her and seemed delighted by her growing abilities. The town's initial whispers about Faith and Colton had mostly subsided, replaced by a general acceptance of his role as her friend and protector. If some still speculated about the nature of their relationship, they at least had the decency to do so out of Faith's hearing. One evening in late June, as they sat on Faith's porch watching the sunset, Emma already asleep inside, Colton broached a subject they had both been carefully avoiding. Faith, he began, his voice uncharacteristically hesitant, I've been thinking about the future. Faith's heart quickened. Oh, the mine's not doing so well, Colton continued. Owner says they might have to lay off some men if the next vein doesn't prove richer. Faith frowned. Would you be among those laid off? Possibly. I was one of the last hired. Colton looked out at the darkening horizon. But I've been saving and I've had my eye on a piece of land about 10 miles south of here. Good water, decent grazing. Could run a small herd of cattle, maybe do some farming. You want to be a rancher? Faith asked, surprised. Colton had never mentioned such ambitions before. It's what I know best, Colton admitted. Mining was just a way to earn enough to get started. He turned to look at her directly. Faith, I know it's only been a few months since Thomas passed, and I don't want to rush you or dishonor his memory. But I care for you and Emma more than I thought possible. Faith's breath caught in her throat. She had known, of course, that Colton's feelings ran deeper than friendship, just as she had been increasingly aware of her own growing attachment to him. But neither had spoken of it, out of respect for her mourning period. Colton, you don't need to say anything now, he interrupted gently. I just wanted you to know that when you're ready, if you're ever ready, I'd be honored to court you properly. To build a life with you and Emma. Faith looked at this man who had stood beside her in her darkest hour and had never walked away, who had shown her kindness without expectation, who had become so essential to her daily life that she could hardly imagine a future without him. I care for you too, Colton, she said softly. More than I thought I could care for anyone after Thomas, but I'm afraid. Afraid of losing someone again, afraid of what people might say. Colton reached out slowly and took her hand in his. It was the first time he had touched her so deliberately, outside of dancing or helping her over a rough patch of ground. His hand was warm and calloused, strong but gentle. "I can't promise nothing bad will ever happen," he said, his voice low and serious. "No one can. But I can promise that as long as I have breath in my body, I will do everything in my power to keep you and Emma safe and cared for. As for what people might say, well, folks will talk no matter what we do. Best to live in a way that gives them as little ammunition as possible, but not to let it stop us from finding happiness." Faith looked down at their joined hands, feeling a sense of rightness that both comforted and frightened her. "I think I would like for you to court me, Colton," she finally said. "But slowly. I'm still finding my way." The smile that broke across Colton's face was like the sun emerging from behind clouds. "Slowly it is," he agreed. "We have all the time in the world." That night, after Colton had gone home and Faith was preparing for bed, she found herself standing before the small photograph of Thomas that sat on her dresser. It was their wedding portrait, both of them looking young and hopeful. "I'll always love you," she whispered to the image of her first husband. "And I'll make sure Emma knows you, knows the kind of man her father was." She touched the frame gently. "But I think you would want us to be happy, to be safe. And Colton makes us both happy." She thought she felt a sense of peace settle over her, as if Thomas had somehow heard and understood. With a lighter heart than she had known in months, Faith went to bed. Colton was true to his word about courting her slowly. Their daily routine didn't change much, but now there were small additions: flowers appearing on her porch in the morning, a handwritten note tucked into her lunch basket, his hand seeking hers as they walked through town. Each gesture was modest but meaningful, establishing their new relationship in a way that respected her status as a recent widow. By August, Faith found herself looking forward to Colton's visits with an anticipation that went beyond friendship. Emma, too, had become deeply attached to him, often toddling to the door when she heard his footsteps on the porch and raising her arms to be picked up as soon as he entered. "She's got you wrapped around her little finger," Faith observed one evening as Colton patiently allowed Emma to help him whittle, his large hands guiding her tiny one safely around the knife. "Guilty as charged," Colton admitted with a smile. "She's a special little girl." "You're good with her," Faith said softly. "Better than I could have hoped for." Colton looked up, his expression serious. "She makes it easy, and I—" He hesitated, then continued, "I never thought I'd have the chance to be a father. After the war, after everything that happened, I figured that kind of life wasn't meant for me." Faith wanted to ask what he meant, what had happened that had made him believe himself unworthy of family, but she sensed it was a painful topic. Instead, she said, "Emma is lucky to have you in her life. We both are." The smile he gave her then was so full of tenderness that Faith felt her heart might burst. That September, Colton's fears about the mine came true. The new vein proved disappointing, and several miners, including Colton, were laid off. Faith worried about what this would mean for his plans and for them, but Colton seemed almost relieved. "I've saved enough," he told her when he brought the news. "And I've spoken to the owner of that land I mentioned. He's willing to sell for a fair price." He hesitated, then added, "It's a good piece of land, Faith. Room for a bigger cabin, maybe a proper house someday. Garden space. Room for Emma to run and play." Faith understood what he wasn't saying, that he was planning for their future together, a future he hoped would include her and Emma living on that land with him. "When will you move out there?" she asked, trying to keep the anxiety from her voice. 10 miles wasn't far, but it would mean seeing much less of him. "I thought I'd start building right away," Colton said. Get the basics up before winter sets in, but I'll still be in town often, bringing supplies, checking on you and Emma." Faith nodded, trying to be supportive despite her mixed feelings. "I'm happy for you, Colton. This is what you've been working toward." Colton studied her face for a moment, then said gently, "Come see it with me, Faith. Tomorrow, Mrs. Abernathy would give you the day off, I'm sure. I want you to see it through your own eyes." The next day they set out early, Colton driving a borrowed wagon with Faith and Emma beside him. The September morning was crisp but sunny, promising a beautiful day. Emma was excited by the adventure, pointing at birds and trees and babbling happily. The land, when they reached it, took Faith's breath away. It was nestled in a small valley with a clear stream running through it, surrounded by rolling hills that would provide good grazing. A stand of pine trees offered shelter from the wind, and a natural clearing provided the perfect spot for a cabin. "Oh, Colton," Faith breathed as he helped her down from the wagon. "It's beautiful." "I thought you'd like it," Colton said, his expression hopeful. "There's good soil for gardening over there, and I thought the cabin could face east to catch the morning sun." As he showed her around, pointing out his plans, Faith could see it all so clearly: a cozy cabin with a stone hearth, a garden full of vegetables and flowers, Emma playing safely in the yard. A home. Their home. They stopped by the stream for lunch, spreading a blanket on the grassy bank. Emma crawled about, fascinated by the butterflies that flitted among the late summer wildflowers. As Faith watched her daughter's delight, she felt a certainty settle in her heart. "Colton," she said, turning to the man who had become so dear to her, "I don't want to wait any more." He looked at her, confusion giving way to understanding. "Faith, are you sure?" She nodded. "Life is too short and too uncertain to waste time when you know what you want." She reached for his hand. "And I know that I want a life with you, here on this land. I want Emma to grow up with you as her father. I want—" She blushed but continued, "I want to be your wife." For a moment, Colton seemed stunned. Then his face broke into the most radiant smile Faith had ever seen. He pulled her gently into his arms, mindful of Emma nearby. "Faith Sullivan," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "nothing would make me happier than making you my wife." Their first kiss was gentle and sweet, full of promise and tender affection. When they broke apart, both were smiling, and Emma chose that moment to toddle over and demand to be included, raising her arms imperiously. Laughing, Colton swept her up and included her in their embrace. "What do you think, little one?" he asked. "Would you like to live here with me and your mama?" Emma patted his cheek with her small hand and said very clearly, "Pa." Faith gasped, and Colton's eyes widened in surprise. It was Emma's first real word, and the significance of it brought tears to both their eyes. "I think that's a yes," Faith whispered, her heart full to bursting. They were married 2 weeks later in the small church in Silver Gulch, with Mrs. Abernathy and Mr. Chen as witnesses. The ceremony was simple but heartfelt, and if some in town thought it too soon after Thomas's death, many more were happy to see Faith and Emma secure in the care of a good man like Colton Reed. The new cabin wasn't finished before winter set in, so they spent their first months as a family in Faith's small cabin in town. Colton rode out to the property whenever the weather permitted to continue work on their future home, returning each evening to his new wife and daughter. Those winter months were cozy and intimate, the three of them learning to be a family. Colton was patient and loving, never trying to replace Thomas in Faith's heart but creating his own place there. With Emma, he was a natural father, endlessly patient with her growing independence and delighting in her developing personality. Faith continued to work at the general store, saving every penny toward their new life. In the evenings, she sewed curtains and quilts for their new home, while Colton crafted simple furniture by the fire. They talked of their hopes for the future, perhaps more children, a prosperous small ranch, security and happiness for Emma. By early spring, the new cabin was habitable, and they made the move on a bright April day, almost exactly a year after Thomas's funeral. As Colton carried Faith over the threshold, Emma in her arms, Faith felt a sense of completion, of coming full circle. "Welcome home, Mrs. Reed," Colton said, setting her gently on her feet in their new cabin. Faith looked around at the simple but solid walls, the stone fireplace Colton had built with his own hands, the windows placed to catch the morning light just as he had promised. Outside, the first wildflowers were beginning to bloom, and in the distance, a small herd of cattle, the beginning of their ranch, grazed peacefully. "It's perfect," she said, leaning into her husband's embrace as Emma squirmed to be put down and explore. "Absolutely perfect." That night, after Emma was asleep in her new little room just off the main living area, Faith and Colton stood on their porch, looking up at the stars that seemed to shine more brightly here, away from the lights of town. "A year ago, I thought my life was over," Faith said softly. "I couldn't imagine a future without Thomas, couldn't see how Emma and I would survive." Colton wrapped his arm around her shoulders, drawing her close against the spring chill. "And now?" Faith turned in his embrace to look up at him, at this man who had held an umbrella over her at a funeral and had never walked away. "Now I know that life can begin again, even after great loss. That love can come when you least expect it and bring healing with it." Colton bent to kiss her, a kiss that spoke of devotion and commitment, of a shared future and a love that had grown slowly but surely from the seeds of compassion and respect. "I love you, Faith Reed," he whispered against her lips. "And I love you, Colton Reed," she replied, her heart full of gratitude for this second chance at happiness. "With all that I am." As they stood together under the vast Montana sky, Faith knew that whatever challenges the future might hold, they would face them together, she, Colton, and Emma. A family forged in grief but sustained by love, hope, and the courage to begin again. 5 years later, 1882, the sound of children's laughter drifted through the open windows of the Reed Ranch house on a warm June afternoon. Faith looked up from her mending to see Colton in the yard, Emma perched on his shoulders while their 3-year-old son, Thomas, and 2-year-old daughter, Sarah, chased after them in a game of make-believe. The sight brought a smile to Faith's face. The years had been kind to them. The ranch had prospered under Colton's capable management, growing from a modest operation to one of the most successful in the county. The original cabin had been expanded into a comfortable home, with enough room for their growing family and occasional guests. Emma, now nearly 6, had no memory of her birth father, but Faith and Colton had made sure she knew about Thomas Sullivan, keeping his photograph in a place of honor and telling her stories of his dreams and courage. She called Colton Pa without hesitation, secure in the knowledge that she was deeply loved by both her parents. Little Thomas, named for Faith's first husband, had his mother's quiet thoughtfulness combined with Colton's determination. Sarah, the baby of the family, was a whirlwind of energy and curiosity, constantly exploring and challenging her older siblings to keep up. Faith set aside her mending and moved to the porch, watching as Colton pretended to be a wild horse, bucking gently while Emma squealed with delight and clung to his neck. Thomas and Sarah danced around them, waving imaginary lassos and shouting, "Get the wild horse, Emma." Eventually, Colton allowed himself to be captured, collapsing dramatically onto the grass while all 3 children piled on top of him, giggling helplessly. His laughter joined theirs, deep and joyful, Faith's heart swelled with love for this man who had brought such happiness into their lives. He had kept every promise he'd made that day by the stream to be a good father to Emma, to build them a secure home, to love Faith faithfully and completely. As if sensing her thoughts, Colton looked up and caught her watching. His smile softened, becoming the special one he reserved just for her. Gently disentangling himself from the children, he said, "Why don't you three go check on those kittens in the barn? See if they've opened their eyes yet. But remember, just look, don't touch." The children raced off toward the barn, Emma taking charge of her younger siblings with the seriousness of an older sister. Colton made his way to the porch, his eyes never leaving Faith's face. "You look deep in thought, Mrs. Reed," he said, climbing the steps to stand before her. "Just counting my blessings," Faith replied, reaching up to brush a strand of hay from his shirt. At 38, Colton had a few strands of gray at his temples and lines around his eyes that spoke of years spent working outdoors, but to Faith, he was more handsome than ever. Colton caught her hand and brought it to his lips, a gesture that still made her heart skip after 5 years of marriage. "And how does the count stand?" "Too many to number," Faith said softly, "but they begin and end with you." Colton drew her into his arms, resting his chin on top of her head. "Do you ever think about that day?" he asked. "At the funeral," Faith nodded against his chest. "Often. How could I not? It was the worst day of my life, and yet—" She looked up at him. "And yet it was also the beginning of something wonderful." "I didn't plan to stay, you know," Colton admitted, something he had never told her before. "When I went to the funeral, I paid my respects, was about to leave with everyone else. But then I saw you standing there in the rain, holding Emma, looking so alone, and I just couldn't walk away." Faith reached up to touch his face, tracing the familiar lines with tender fingers. "I thank God every day that you didn't." "I thank him too," Colton said, his voice husky with emotion, "for giving me the courage to stay, for giving us this second chance." From the barn came the sound of excited children's voices, and then Emma appeared, running toward the house with her siblings trailing behind her. "Pa, Ma, the kittens' eyes are open, all of them. Can we name them now, please?" Colton chuckled, releasing Faith but keeping one arm around her waist. "I suppose that was the deal, wasn't it? Once their eyes opened, you could name them." The children crowded onto the porch, all talking at once about potential names for the 5 barn kittens. As Faith watched Colton patiently listening to each suggestion, negotiating compromises between the siblings with the diplomatic skill he brought to all family matters, she felt a profound sense of gratitude. Life had taken an unexpected turn that rainy April day at the cemetery, when a kind cowboy had held an umbrella over a grieving widow and her baby. What had begun as a simple act of decency had grown into a love that sustained and nourished them all, a love that had given Faith the strength to begin again when she thought all hope was lost. That evening, after the children were tucked into bed with stories of brave cowboys and adventurous pioneers, Faith and Colton sat on their porch swing, watching the sunset paint the Montana sky in brilliant oranges and pinks. Colton's arm was around her shoulders, and Faith's head rested comfortably against him, their bodies fitting together with the easy familiarity of years together. "I got a letter from Mrs. Abernathy today," Faith mentioned. "She says Silver Gulch is changing. The railroad's coming through next year." "Progress," Colton mused. "Good for business, I suppose, though it'll change the character of the place." Faith nodded. "She asked if we ever regret moving out here away from town." "And what did you tell her?" "That I wouldn't trade this life for all the conveniences in the world," Faith said simply. "That this is where we belong." Colton pressed a kiss to her temple. "Smart woman, my wife." They fell silent, content to watch the day fade into evening, the first stars beginning to appear in the darkening sky. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote called, answered by another farther away. The familiar sounds of their ranch at night surrounded them, cattle lowing softly, the gentle creak of the windmill, the rustling of leaves in the evening breeze. "Colton," Faith said after a while. Thank you for never walking away." Colton's arm tightened around her, and when he spoke, his voice was thick with emotion. "Walking away was never an option, Faith. Not from the moment I saw you standing in that cemetery. Something in me knew this is where I belong, with you and Emma." Faith turned in his embrace to look at him, this man who had become the center of her world. "I love you, Colton Reed, more with each passing day." "And I love you, Faith Reed," he replied, bending to kiss her softly. "Yesterday, today, and all our tomorrows." As the last light faded from the sky, they remained on the porch, wrapped in each other's arms and in the life they had built together, a life that had begun with an act of kindness on the saddest of days, and had blossomed into a love story as vast and enduring as the Montana sky above them.